Hello and welcome to this NPTEL course titled The Novel and Change. We're looking at Tsitsi Dangarembga's novel Nervous Conditions. So we're looking specifically, as we have in the last couple of sessions, the role of the colonial missionary school in the production and circulation and different forms of iterations of characters and subject positions in this particular novel. So if you remember the last session, we talked about how, in particular, there are different drifts which are created by the colonial missionary education program. Of course, Baba Mukuro is the patriarch who was the first beneficiary of the program. And then, of course, we see how in an intergenerational way, the colonial missionary school serves in a very ambivalent manner, and both in terms of liberating certain subject positions, at the same time consolidating certain earlier patriarchal positions. So this should be on your screen. So one of the most profound and pervasive effects of the missions was the dissemination of English as a language, and that's something we talked about already in terms of how this emancipatory program was also collusive, of course, with different forms of imperial institutionalization, which then in turn also served to consolidate certain positions of power. So language of education, government, and commerce. This is exemplified at a deep level in the structure of Things Fall Apart, where Achebe draws upon the biblical account of the sacrifice of Isaac in a suggestive intertextual relationship that comments ironically upon Okunku's sacrifice of Ikemefuna and the later decision of Noe to convert to Christianity. So the different biblical subtexts also serve to accentuate the different actions and plot progressions in Things Fall Apart. But there's one fundamental difference, as we have discussed already, between Achebe's Things Fall Apart and Dangarembga's Nervous Conditions. Because in Dangarembga's novel, the contest is not really between two fate systems. In fact, what is very consciously calibrated and described is how, it doesn't matter which fate system is in play, there are different forms of repression which are created, directed against the female subjects. So Dangarembga is far more self-consciously aware of the paradoxes implicit when deploying the alien language of an imperial power as a means of self-expression and political activism. She sensitively registers the estrangement it can produce within the self and the barriers it can erect between family members, right? So the sense of estrangement and alienation is what creates this economy of nervous conditions in Dangarembga's novel. So the nervousness or the neurotic conditions which are there in this particular novel is a product of, is a function of the entanglement of the political landscape and the nervous psychological landscape, and how they create and co-create each other. Thus, Namo, after going to live with his uncle, gradually becomes ashamed to speak the Shona language, which means his mother is unable to communicate with him. So you can see how language itself becomes some kind of a method through which different forms of estrangement, different forms of alienation are created. And of course, the missionary presence is an epistemic engine through which the language barriers are further consolidated. And that's a quotation which appears in the novel. First, you took his tongue so that he could not speak to me, and now you have taken everything for good. Baba Mukuro, through I spit at you, you and your education have killed my son, right? So you can see how the word killed over here both means a literal and abstract metaphorical level is a decimation and erasure of a subject position. And when we say erasure of a subject position, it also means the erasure of the entire cultural template which characterizes that subject, right? So when the accusation against Baba Mukuro that he comes back and really destroys and decimates in his family all the erstwhile markers of Shona culture, that becomes an act of cultural assassination or epistemic erasure, as one could call it. So similarly, Nyasha and Shidor, following their time in England, are almost unfamiliar with the language of the parents and cousins. My only fear is that when Tambuzai leaves to go first to mission school and later to the Sacred Heart, that she will lose her daughter too. So you can see how the sense of loss is also created culturally. So how the colonial mission over here, or the missionary presence as an institution over here, creates different forms of departure, different forms of removal from erstwhile structures of kinship, cultural affinity, and so on. So education promises the possibility of escape from poverty and entrance into an unfamiliar and intriguing world of texts and learning. Yet it also entails inevitable separation from family and a measure of complicity with the imperial power that controls the education system. Frequently, this fractures the individual's sense of self, right? So this is the heart of the essay, really, in terms of looking at the significance of the title nervous condition. So the fractured sense of self, the self-alienation created over here, which obviously contributes to nervous conditions, are part of a larger structural program which includes education, which includes different forms of estrangement created by the education system. Right, so you can see how the imperial power is obviously collusive with the knowledge paradigms and knowledge networks which are created around the subject here. But at the same time, what they all do together in a collusive way is this ambivalent activity of liberation and alienation, right? So that which liberates you also alienates you from the community, from your family members, some structures of kinship, right? That sense of alienation is described in a very intergenerational way in nervous conditions. So the nervous conditions explored as characteristic of the native subject are embedded within a textual nature of the novels themselves as African literature written in English, right? So again, the very decision, we talked about this already, the very decision of writers such as Achebe and Dangarembga to write in English is itself that entanglement of aspiration and alienation. Because on one hand, they aspire to reach out to a global market of readership, which is why I'm reading this novel in 2024 and sitting here in India. But at the same time, this also creates a sense of alienation from the earlier structures of knowledge, representation, and narrative formation, right? So for the fictional Tambuzai and the very real Achebe and Dangarembga, the act of utterance itself is problematic. So the choice of iteration, the choice of a medium of iteration is itself a problematic political choice. The narratives they tell are born out of their education and language offered by the missions, which threatens a consuming alienation at the very moment of empowerment, right? So we can see how this is a double-edged sword, because on one hand there is empowerment, there is emancipation, there's liberation, there's a breaking away from many erstwhile structures of oppression, but at the same time this comes at a cost. It also comes with the additional baggage of alienation and departure and removal from early structures of kinship, affinity, and intimacy. So our mission is essentially transcultural, and it raises issues related to authority, identity, cultural unity, and hybridity that have been explored anxiously and exhaustively by post-colonial literature and theory. So all these are big themes in post-colonial literature and theory. Sense of identity, authority, unity, and hybridity. And these are all entangled together. So there's no authority which is not always also already part of an anxious economy, right? So authority and anxiety are connected together in very complex discursive ways. Similarly, identity becomes a function of unity and hybridity in a post-colonial agon, right? So the post-colonial identity is both a function of hybridity, mixture, fractured interstitial interactions. At the same time, there is also the aspiration, whether futuristic or nostalgic, of some kind of a powerful hegemonic identity formation, right? So there is that economy of anxiety and aspiration which characterizes the post-colonial agon. So Christian mission is often associated with imperial oppression and is seen as a primary cause of the confusion and difficulties faced by post-colonial societies. Nervous conditions traces its ambivalences of language, female subjection, and power that haunt the lives of those seeking to live with integrity in a strained social environment. Now, the word haunt here is very important because it implies a sense of spectrality, that which doesn't really go away, right? So that which is erased still lingers in the periphery as some kind of a hauntological paradigm, an hauntological existence right? So, of course, I use the word ontology in a Derridan sense, that spectral quality of that knowledge system, that world order, that identity iteration, which is erased but doesn't quite disappear fully, right? So there is a haunted quality in terms of identity formation, which can only happen through fractures. However, Dangarembga does not deal with a crucial issue in relation to mission and its role, which Achebe, writing earlier, explores thoroughly. The transcendental understanding of human existence that informed mission as a distinctly spiritual enterprise, right? So there is a very interesting resistance that Dangarembga does, or rather denial, one could say, of reading the mission through a transcendental spiritual lens. Rather, the mission here is just a function of a cultural point of being, a function of a diachronic point in a post-colonial history. So this produces a moral consciousness that prevents its critique of the central matters raised by the colonial encounter from being constrained by the ultimately reductive and inadequate discourse of ideology and power. Now, Achebe's depiction of mission is a salutary reminder of the choice demanded by convictions that are universal in scope, which missionaries sought to apply to particular cultures. More pertinently, he traces the tragic cultural implications of imperialism without allowing the missionary enterprise to be dismissed as simply the cynical or deluded attempts of an imperialist nation to find ideological justification for the will to power at a global level. Now, this concludes the essay, but it's important for us to see how the fundamental differences get played out between the Achebe representation and the Dangarembga representation. Now, if I could take you back to an earlier passage, and perhaps we can revisit it, because I think it's worth rereading, because I think at the end of this essay, what is important for us to notice is how, for Achebe, the colonial mission comes with a transcendental spiritual force and impetus, which is sometimes at odds with the erstwhile faith systems which were there in Nigeria, in the Igbo communities. Now, in contrast to that, what we see in Dangarembga's novel is how she's not interested really in the transcendental spiritual establishment that is around the aura around that enterprise of colonial mission. Rather, by the time in which she's writing, the colonial missionary presence in Zimbabwe in 1950s and 60s is an always already mainstream position of identity, right? Now, if I could just take you back to this bit that we discussed earlier, if you look at the difference between Nyasha and Tambuzai in nervous condition, and then that really corroborates what we're talking about here. But Nyasha represents or embodies the transgressive post-colonial identity, which wants to break free, which wants to move away from earlier structures of knowledge, earlier structures of power, earlier structures of identity iterations. Now, obviously, that becomes a problem because as a daughter of Baba Mukuro, as someone who belongs to the generation after Baba Mukuro, the problem that she embodies is that her over-appropriation of the colonial, missionary promise, which is obviously one of anxiety and aspiration. So the aspirational impetus, which is embodied by Nyasha, becomes a problem because of its over-identification, over-appropriation of the colonial Western logic of knowledge, narrative formation, and identity iteration. So in that sense, it's a very interesting comparison. In that sense, she may be compared to the character of Quds in Heart of Darkness, because even in Quds you find the horror or the monstrosity embodied by Quds is precisely a function of his over-appropriation of the Enlightenment paradigm, the Eurocentric paradigm that had served him so well, that he had served so well, right? But he becomes a transgressive figure, a problem figure for the same paradigm because of his over-appropriation of the system. So Nyasha becomes someone somewhat comparable in that sense. So if I could just revisit this bit, having read the whole essay, and then maybe you can dial back to some of the earlier things which we probably haven't unpacked as closely as we should. Nyasha's problems here center on a concern for issues of integrity, identity, and exposure of hypocrisy. We talked about this, how Baba Mukuro, his position of power, his position of authority and generosity is also in a very dark way dependent or contingent on his abuse of his wife, whose meager salary as a school teacher he completely usurps to create his aura of generosity by buying gifts with that money, right? Now, of course, what that means is the gentility embodied by Baba Mukuro, or the colonial success story, the gentle manly masculinity that is embodied by him, also comes with a sense of shame, also comes with a sense of betrayal, also comes with a sense of abuse. Now, in that sense, again, nervous condition has some interesting parallels, one might argue, with Dickens's Great Expectations, which we have studied already in this course. Because even in Great Expectations, you find how the ultimate aspirational masculinity, which is embodied by Pip in the novel, is also in some sense connected with shame, connected with an inglorious narrative of source coming from money, coming from wealth, coming from a questionable source, which in that case of in Great Expectations is that of a convict. Now, in the case of Baba Mukuro, the money that funds literally his generosity comes from his abuse of his wife in many sense. So therein lies a hypocrisy which the transgressive figure of Naisha calls out. Now, we discuss also how Tambuzai wants to take a more nuanced position. So she wants to be the insider, at the same time she wants to be a beneficiary of the colonial missionary enterprise of the Indian. So unlike Naisha, she doesn't become a transgressive figure. So her character is more complex. Her character is someone who embodies critique as well as consolidation at both levels. So Tambuzai, though, exists in a double bind configured by a very different set of social circumstances. She cannot dismiss as easily as Naisha the material weight of poverty that she has known since birth. We discussed this already, but it's worth revisiting how the sense of poverty, or the memory of poverty, one might call it, still haunts Tambuzai. And we just read the haunting quality of the novel, which is why I want to read that section first and then come back here, because there is a lot of spectrality which takes place in nervous condition, right? And again, the whole idea of nervousness or trauma, if you remember the Freudian vocabulary around trauma, it also relies massively on spectral returns or traumatic triggers, which are recursive in quality, right? So the recursivity of trauma, the recursivity of anxiety is also connected, or may be connected, with a sense of spectrality. So Tambuzai has also suffered acutely from the patriarchal and even misogynistic aspects of Shona culture that favors her brother, legitimizes persecution, and places firm restrictions on viable options for the future. So again, we discussed this in the last class, but again, what is important for us to reconnect here is how these structures of repression get replayed, get reiterated, are recursive in quality, and doesn't really go away because of a new educational mission or a new epistemic engine. So in some sense, the colonial missionary institution further reinforces patriarchal oppression, further reinforces forms of marginalization. Now, we talked about how the idea of marriage through Christian rites becomes an element of shock. And of course, that creates this moral vocabulary, this moral valency around what is legitimate, what is illegitimate, what is desirable, acceptable, respectable, and what qualifies as fallen, and how the fallibility of identity is a social construct, or the idea of the fallen identity, or the less privileged identity, or the shameful, inglorious identity. These become different functions of social value systems, cultural value systems, and in a very relativistic kind of way, right? So we can see how Tambuzai's sense of shame, Tambuzai's sense of inglorious, a sense of illegitimacy, also emerges from her comparison apropos of the Christian constructs of marriage, as someone who can be read as born out of wedlock, as it were, right? Now, this again is the intersection of the psychological and political landscapes, the psychological and political forms of oppression which characterize nervous conditions. Now, and that last bit in this paragraph over here, the Achebe Dangarembga contrast is worth reinforcing and reiterating, where Achebe is conscious of the religious charge implicit in this moral issues, which the theoretical preoccupation with ideologies as a tool of those in power seems to drain of any pressing relevance in the context of nervous conditions, right? So the religiosity of the mission, the spirituality embodied by the missions, they take a backseat when it comes to nervous condition, right? Which is a novel more occupied or more, is more focused towards how these institutional paradigms, these institutional structures, they consolidate different forms of oppression, different forms of nervousness in a post-colonial nation state. Now, we can see how the idea of anxiety and aspiration are intertwined with each other, again in very spectral ways, which is why I wanted to do that bit in the end and then come back and reread these passages, because when you find that Tambuzai is about to get enrolled in a Sacred Heart institution, there is a sense of aspiration obviously associated with it, in a sense how this institution can open up new avenues for her, can open up new aspects of a journey, aspects of a progression, aspects of a growth as a social subject. But at the same time, this comes at a cost of an erasure of erstwhile identity, erasure of erstwhile belief systems, and more importantly, an erasure of the intimate structures of kinship in an intra-familial setting, which is something which is quite heavily present in the representation and nervous conditions. Now, we talked about how the difference between Nyasha and Tambuzai is worth mentioning again, because Nyasha becomes the ultimate overreacher, the ultimate transgressor, who doesn't really have any ambivalence about what she is critiquing. Whereas Tambuzai is someone who is a more careful negotiator, a more careful navigator between value systems, between the colonial, the pre-colonial, and the post-colonial value systems. So in that sense, this novel becomes a very interesting intergenerational novel, because one may read Nyasha's character as the sort of the post-colonial subject, whereas Tambuzai over here becomes a perfect post-colonial subject, in a sense that she embodies, inhabits that cusp of change from the colonial to the post-colonial. And we see how in the novel the transition from Rhodesia to Zimbabwe and the growth of Tambuzai as a character are almost synchronous with each other, which makes the novel very complex. And again, it reinforces the point how the political landscape and the psychological landscape, they correspond with one another in very complex ways. So we see how the different forms of empathy and kinship are also established in nervous conditions, and that is how Tambuzai also speaks for other female subjects, both before and after her, female subjects, including her kins who are female kins, as well as other women in her contemporary conditions of society, which is the function again of hybridity, right? And we see how there's a very interesting relationship that she has, or affinity that she has, with the other white children in the sort of mission institution, who are the only white people present at that point of time in that site, who also face different forms of anxieties around cultural hybridity, right? Now, we see how the language becomes interesting, and we just finished this section, but we'll just wind up with this, because language becomes a very important political tool of rewriting, and as well as being a representational method that both Achebe and Dangarembga are using. But what's interesting and what is worth winding up with is the choice of English over here. It's not just a simple post-colonial rewriting paradigm, right? And not just simply connected to the desires and the market of a post-colonial readership. But it's also useful for us to understand over here how the language is bent, reshaped, and used in a way which is very different from the colonizer's language, right? So you find how the local inflections, how the colonial, pre-colonial, post-colonial inflections enter the language which is used, or English, which is used to narrate the story in nervous conditions. In that sense, it belongs to language very close to the suffering subject, the shattered subject, the claustrophobic subject, the imprisoned subject, right? So the nervous condition over here becomes really a function of narrativity. So in conclusion, in terms of reading this particular essay, I think nervous condition becomes one of the three profound post-colonial novels which look at the interfaces between neurosis and narrativity, and the trauma it represents, the psychological form of imprisonment it represents. It moves away from a public space monumental model of trauma and rather looks at the intimate territories of trauma in the intrafamilial settings, how tools such as language, how methods such as narrativity, how methods such as storytelling, which are considered to be quote-unquote innocuous in quality, can also become profoundly and deeply designed in a discursive way in order to create differences in identity, both within one subject as well as across subjects, right? So you find how the kinship structures begin to break, begin to get fractured in nervous conditions, which create different forms of alienation, separation, removal, and so on and so forth. So just to sum up, hybridity in nervous condition is not seen as an uncritical, euphoric celebration of a post-colonial function or post-colonial regime or post-colonial subject formation. Hybridity also comes with a sense of loss. Hybridity also comes with a sense of alienation. So hybridity is not, it may not be uncritically equated with inclusivity over here. So hybridity can also become a method of separation, a method of segregation, a method of marginalization, right? And among many things, nervous conditions is also novel about the overt as well as covert forms of marginalization, the overt as well as covert forms of identity alterations, which are also forms of removal, forms of alienation, forms of estrangement, right? So it is not an accident, really, that Frantz Fanon is such an important presence in this particular novel, because like Fanon, what Dangarembga is trying to do is look at the medical and the political as intertwined in very complex ways to create the shattered subject of post-coloniality, right? So the post-colonial subject is shattered, is fractured, is interstitial. It may connect to celebratory utopian possibilities, but it can equally connect to schizophrenic possibilities, schizophrenic situations. So you remember Fanon's work on schizophrenia, Fanon's work on split selves, Fanon's work on shattered subjects, and how looking at the subjects through a medical lens also requires us to situate the subjects in those complex political conditions, right? Ones which include oppression, marginalization in covert as well as overt forms. Now, we wind up with this essay at this point, but it's worth mentioning one more time that if you look at these two novels, When Things Fall Apart and Nervous Conditions, they occupy different diachronic points, as you've said already. They occupy different geopolitical settings, but at a fundamental level, they are examples of colonial and post-colonial novels, which are obviously dialogued with each other. They belong to the same continent and of comparable cultures. But whereas the white presence, the missionary presence, the imperial engines begin to have a formative, monstrous, exotic other in Things Fall Apart, they become very much part of the mainstream social and moral fabric in Nervous Conditions, only in as much as to reconsolidate and be appropriated by earlier forms of patriarchy, earlier forms of repression, and work in collusion with that. So Nervous Condition is about the doubly marginalized subject and how the choices and voices which are available to this doubly marginalized subject are very limited, and how the doubly marginalized subject will have to navigate across interstitial spaces rather than monumental public spaces, right? So the interstitiality is part of the nervousness over here, but the interstitiality is also the only method through which the nervous subjects may acquire and iterate different forms of agency. With that, we conclude this particular essay. We'll have another session on this particular novel. We'll take up another lens to look at through which we'll interpret the different plot structures, characterizations, and how this novel becomes a really interesting text in terms of depicting and calibrating its complex cultural and geopolitical context. So with that, we stop this particular essay, we wind up this particular essay, and we move on to another text in a subsequent class. Thank you for your attention.